Quilts are as much a social outlet as a creative outlet. And they've become a way that women can express concern and feeling on a variety of issues.
People are excited about quilts. It shows the history of their family, and there is something tangible that mom or grandma or sister or somebody back in Europe did, and here it is, and isn't it wonderful? And it is wonderful. There are many treasures.
I love it all. The journey's wonderful, but I think the destination, because I want to get on to the next one.
I just make them to make them. I don't make them for a particular reason. I just love making them. And I have to see how it's going to turn out.
You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
The history of quilts is rich, varied, and influenced by many different ethnic groups and quilters. Throughout time, quilts have had different purposes: warmth, protection, household decoration, and therapy. Some are nothing more than utility quilts used for warmth and bedding. Others are considered artwork and are showcased for admiration. Today, some quilt owners travel from quilt show to quilt show, seeking approval of their creations from their peers in the quilting world. Many win awards and are recognized both here at home and across the country. Some quilts have great monetary value, while others have sentimental value. Some are even historically significant. Quilts can tell a story, and many are family heirlooms passed down from generation to generation. Quilting can be traced back to ancient Egypt and China. Quilts are defined as 3 layers of fabric that are quilted together to hold them in place.
It was used in the Orient as a protection. If you put enough layers of fabric, it'll stop an arrow going through. And so, particularly if that's silk. Silk is such a strong fiber that quilts made from silk were worn as armor before there was metal. And so that came with the Mongolians over to the Mideast. And one of the things it did when the Crusades went to the Mideast, they brought back quilting to Europe. The Crusaders used it as padding between their skin and their armor. Well, when you bring it back to Europe, now there's a whole bunch of things you can use it for.
There's evidence in some sculptures or drawings from ancient Egypt that there are people who are wearing what might be quilted garments. So that's a little harder to say with specificity, whether that's accurate or not.
Probably our biggest influence in the United States was from Great Britain.
The quilt as we know it in America, dating back to the colonial days, was mainly created and used out of necessity for bed covers and warmth. The earliest American quilts were so connected to everyday life of early-day settlers, few records of them exist.
We need to remember that England and Europe had quilting, but the Americans brought it to a whole new level, really developed it, really used it, really made it part of the culture.
The problem with studying textiles is they don't last forever. They get used and worn out.
When it comes to the history behind quilt making in America, there's a difference between nostalgia and reality. The idea of colonial day women sitting around the fire or in groups stitching quilts is a myth.
You have to think about how readily available were materials then, and what was being manufactured or made in the United States and what was being imported. The idea of colonial women sitting by the fireside and stitching little pieces of fabric together that are reclaimed from clothing is pretty much a myth. We have to wait until we get the Industrial Revolution, where we start to mass produce cloth, where then we can begin to cut it up into little pieces and make fancy designs. So here's an example of where the quilt history follows technology and economics and commerce.
A lot of the American quilts that we think of, the traditional quilts we think of, are patchwork patterns that grew up in America and have been shared now across boundaries. The basic 9 patches, a lot of those first patterns in terms of applique patterns developed in this country and were again expressions of what people wanted to do, how they felt about certain issues.
Today, there is a movement across the country to find some of that lost history. Quilt documentarians are encouraging quilt owners to document details they do know about their own family heirlooms. Mary Reese Fitzgerald, a former school teacher, is a quilter and author of the book South Dakota Quilts and Quilt Makers. She spent several years documenting many of South Dakota's quilts that were made before 1970.
It shows my work with documentation of quilts over a 6-year period in South Dakota. The quilt had to reside in South Dakota, although it did not have to be made here. And it's divided into pieced, appliqued, embroidered, whole cloth, crazy quilt styles. And I chose 1970 because that was just before the beginning of the current quilt revival again. And it was before our bicentennial, which really saw a big influx of quilting work again and shops. I knew that other states were producing these books about the quilts in their state. And I thought South Dakota needs to do this. And I thought there was some urgency because I know people are dying, people are moving away, the children are moving away from South Dakota and taking these treasures with them.
Mary retired from Flandreau Indian School and later earned a master's degree in the history of textiles, quilt studies from the University of Nebraska. Mary then began her journey of documenting quilts in her home state of South Dakota.
I can collect who the owner is, how they acquired it. Did they find it in a trunk in the attic after Dad died? Did they purchase it? Did a neighbor give it to them? How did they acquire it? And then I have a 3-page sheet that I go through and look at very specific things. We start with what kind was it, put it in a category, and then I count the number of stitches per inch when it's quilted. I look at what the fiber is that was used to construct the fabric, what kind of condition is it in, is it blocks or is it one piece, or how is it arranged? Is it handwork or is it machine work? How is the binding attached? What's the back look like? And all of those things together can give me an idea of when the quilt was made. Probably the first thing that you look at when you look at a quilt and determine the age is if there are prints in the quilt, that is a good way to determine when was that print popular, and it gives you a good idea of when to go forward.
On this day, Mary is documenting quilts from the family of former Governor George T. Mickelson. Little is known about the quilts or their origin, but Mary uses her expertise to identify the age and materials used, which can help families trace the quilt's heritage.
Put 1930s to early 1940.
Quilts can help tell a story, maybe from a family's past or from a significant time in history. South Dakota has quilts that are considered historically significant, one of which found its way to the Dakota Territorial Museum in Yankton.
There is a quilt down in the museum in Yankton. It's Lone Stars, and when I first saw it, they said this is a centennial quilt from, so it would have been 1876. Well, I got to examine it. It did not say 1876, it's 1878. And as I started looking at it and researching it, I found out that it actually is a centennial of 1878, which was the Battle of Wyoming and Pennsylvania. Americans were overpowered by the British, and the British had enlisted quite a few Native Americans also on their side. As the battle went on, it became very lopsided, and the Americans were losing. A lot of them were captured, many of them were killed. Of those that were captured, many of those were then massacred rather than held as prisoners. So 100 years later, This quilt is commemorating that particular experience in Pennsylvania.
Quilts mean different things to different cultures, and the Lone Star quilt is a treasured tradition among Native Americans. It's one of the most valued gifts of the Sioux people, often created for giveaways at graduations, basketball tournaments, naming ceremonies, marriages, and funerals. The majority of Lakota star quilts are dominated by a single star. However, multiple and broken star patterns are not uncommon.
A Lone Star quilt has 8 points. There are other stars that have 5, 6, and the Lone Star is a 45-degree angle star. And it'll always have 8 points. You can put as many colors in as you want in the points. Any kind of honoring, the star quilt is given to the person that they're honoring, and that's what they've always used the star quilt for. And years ago, they used buffalo hides as gifts. And then as the buffalo became extinct and there were no more hides, that was about the time the settlers came to this area, and the missionary women taught the Native Americans how to quilt.
Susan Carey's family homesteaded in the Parmelee area in the early 1900s. They brought the skill of assembling a quilt to the area, but tied their quilts together rather than hand quilting them. The Native Americans would later teach the Careys the fine art of hand quilting a quilt and the importance of the Lone Star quilt. The Carey family wanted to give back to the community of Parmelee, so Susan's daughter, Cheryl Bartlett, started a quilting business that specializes in Lone Star quilts. Today, the company helps keep the tradition alive while providing job opportunities.
And the Native people here kind of taught me how to quilt, because I knew the tying of the quilts, but I didn't really know the hand stitching. Mom usually had either tied or it was sewn.
And the stories that I hear of the people that helped raise us in this community is that every one of these patches represents someone. They don't really have a name on it, but it's someone. So if the blanket's there, you are kept and you're taken care of and you're secure and you're in that manner if you have these blankets, because all those people are taking care of you. So I think that those traditions have continued on. It's just not a quilt, it's just not a blanket. It's something that's meaningful to a celebration of some sort or a memorial that they are doing a year after year, and they feel like that this is something that they can always contribute back to their families and keep that culture in their communities as well.
I helped ladies quilt sometimes if they were going to have a giveaway and needed somebody to come and help sew. I was fascinated by it because they started doing different designs. Like they would make an eagle instead of a star, but it was the diamonds that were sewn together.
Whenever a woman has a grandchild, she makes a quilt for that grandchild. When a boy plays basketball, they honor him with a basketball star quilt. When they get married, they give them a star quilt, and the services of funeral. It's very important for these women to make the quilts to honor their families.
The living tradition of the star quilt continues to grow and evolve.
The people, the Native American people and the settlers and whoever else that has been out there, I think that they have set a lot of good boundaries and a lot of good teachings on how to make the quilts and the meanings of the quilts. So I foresee that down the road in quilting in general, I feel that that's going to be a connection of families and cultures continually. I don't ever see that going away.
For many families, like Karen Olson's, little is known about some of their quilts. One of their treasures was accidentally discovered when tearing apart an old piece of furniture left behind from when the Olsons first homesteaded in the house Karen and her family now call home.
When we bought a new bedroom set, when we took the mattress off of the spring, we found this quilt between the mattress and the spring in that bed. Not sure how old it is, but I know it's very old.
I think it's an important thing to document your quilt, and not just to say your name and when you made it, but if you used a pattern, whose pattern or whatever, and put a date on it. Historically, women's contributions have been very hidden. Most of the history books document men very well and men's accomplishments, but until recently, women had a support role, and often that wasn't known. And quilting was a way that they did that. They could support Civil War quilts, where they sent a quilt with someone going to war. It was not just to keep the guy warm, but to say, I support what you're doing, I'm with you. It's a way to make a statement. There are quilts that document the horror and that people felt with 9/11, and yet supported people as they were trying to recover from that or to remember loved ones lost in it. The AIDS quilt is another big example. Hundreds of panels made when AIDS was still kind of a stigmatized disease, supporting people, remembering people who had AIDS. And so when you pull a quilt and you see nothing about it except a beautiful piece of fabric, it's like, who made this? Why did they make it? And at least a documentation piece on the back tells you that this is who the woman was and gives you an idea of why she did it, that she believed in this. And so that's why I think documentation is important, that our stories don't get lost.
This was made for Matilda Roth, which would have been Sandra's great-great-grandmother. And it was made for her 44th birthday in 1887 by her sister. This is embroidered, the label is embroidered, and this one is hand quilted. It was completed when we inherited it from Grandma Lynn's family, from Grandma Lynn and her mother and her grandmother.
My mother made a baby quilt for me, and I still have it. It has squares that are embroidered, and I'm sure my grandmother probably also helped her with that. It was all handmade. The first quilt that I ever made was when I was 15 years old. I was in 4-H. I started 4-H when I was 10 years old, and I needed a project to enter in the Marshall County Achievement Days at Britain. Well, I think I did very well. I got a blue ribbon, and I was very pleased with my ribbon.
As families, museums, and quilting enthusiasts work to piece together the history behind many of these creations from yesterday, they are learning that a certain pattern, color, or fabric can tell a great deal about when the quilt was created. During the Great Depression, many of the quilts were made with pastel colors. Some believe it was a quilt maker's way of bringing color into the lives of families struggling during a dark time in American history.
And I think that that is counterintuitive. You think, oh, everybody was so depressed. Well, everybody wasn't so depressed, or else they wanted some joy in their life. Pastel was the biggest thing during the Depression years.
When things were make do or do without, lots of the newspapers, Kansas City Star and others, published quilt patterns that people could share around so that they had an outlet not only for making a quilt and keeping themselves warm, but the piece of beauty that sometimes gets lost.
There are times when a particular color was popular, like 1840 to 1860, red and green quilts were very popular. Then there's the crazy quilt era started like 1880 and never really has died, but there are colors or particular characteristics of quilts that go with a particular era.
Beth Mazzella, a Rapid City quilter and quilt documentarian, was introduced to quilting at an early age. Today she understands that, historically, quilting was far more than just a craft. It was, and still is, a social outlet for many women, a way to express themselves.
I can share with you from my family. My mother was making a bow tie quilt. This was probably in the early 30s. And at that time, the American Legion women needed a fundraiser. And they came up with what they called galloping teas. Now remember, this is the days of the party line where you picked up one phone and 29 people could listen to you. And they would pick up the phone and they'd say, oh, we're going to so-and-so's house. And you were supposed to come as you are when you got the phone call and do whatever had to be done at the house when you got there. And then everybody would throw in small change to pay for the little lunch that they would serve. But Mom was piecing a bow tie quilt. Her mother was making her pep club outfit. So when the ladies came, some lady sewed the pep club outfit, a couple people pieced Mom's quilt. We still have pieces of that quilt. There's the social outlet. There's the issue of getting people together to raise money for whatever the American Legion wanted to do. Quilt guilds and the organizations of quilting are a fairly large segment of the quilting community. And probably you would have sizes range from very small groups that meet frequently, family groups, that sort of thing, to very large guilds. It's a social gathering. That yes, we get together, we talk. And it's not just the monthly meeting or the work days where you are actually getting together to work on a project, but there's like a small group that gets together and hand quilts, so that part of the tradition, the old-fashioned quilting bee, still goes on.
Penny Clanton of Buffalo, South Dakota, is a breast cancer survivor. While going through treatment, she used the hobby as a coping mechanism. Penny also credits quilting and the help of her quilting buddies for pulling her through some of her hardest days.
I could go sit at my sewing machine and forget what was going on in my life at the time. And of course the people, I mean, you know, the guild members and all your friends are so wonderful. There is one up there, and I called her Violetta, which was the name of my mom. And I started making her when I found out I had the cancer. It's an angel. And she's my guardian angel. And I had some of my mom's fabric that I put on the back of the quilt, and it's all hand done. Because I couldn't sit at the sewing machine a lot of time when I was going through the treatments. But I could always do my handwork.
Guilds are a wonderful thing. You know, in faith, probably my best friends are quilters. I don't have to go for therapy because that is my therapy.
Although Eldora Fishback of Faith, South Dakota, learned to sew as a child and even owned her own fabric shop, quilting was not a part of her life. Like many of today's quilters, Eldora's passion came later, after raising a family and retiring from work.
At the time I started, there were very few quilt books. There were no quilt shops hardly. I ended up trying a few at home by drawing my own pattern or whatever. But then there ended up being a quilt shop down here in Rapid. And so we drove down 10 trips and learned how to make a sampler quilt. The whole quilt was pieced by hand. No sewing machine involved at all. And that's how I learned.
My kids were both out of school, and I had a friend that had opened a little quilt store in Buffalo, and she kept after me. I had owned a fabric store of my own and had a lot of ladies coming in looking for the cotton fabrics, and they would buy yards and yards of it. And I thought, why would they want to buy so much fabric and cut it up into little pieces and sew it back together? But she finally talked me into making a quilt, and the rest is history. I haven't stopped since I started making it.
My grandma was making a quilt that she embroidered, and she's making it for me, and then she died before she got it done. And my mom took it and hand quilted it and brought it to me, and my little girl was about 4 years old, and she wanted the quilt. And I said, no. I said, that's Mom's. And so I took it and folded it up and put it in the closet on the top shelf. When I went to bed that night, I felt like my grandma slapped me side the head and said, there's no sense in pretty quilts and cold babies. So when I got up in the morning, I got that quilt off the shelf and gave it to my daughter, and she slept with that quilt until way after college.
I started quilting again as I got closer to retirement, and then when I did retire, then I really started quilting. I learned a lot because things had changed radically since the time my grandmother had taught me to quilt with tools and new machines and all kinds of wonderful things to make your quilting easier and better, and took classes and watched videos, went to a lot of quilt shows.
Quilt shows are eagerly anticipated events for quilters all over the country. The shows are opportunities for quilters to showcase their talents, learn the latest quilting techniques, shop for fabrics and gadgets, and see what other quilters have worked on over the past year. Trunk shows allow specific quilters to showcase their own creations or collections.
The Rapid City Quilt Show is one of the biggest quilt shows in the Midwest. We do have people come from Wyoming and Nebraska and North Dakota and sometimes as far as from Minnesota to come to the quilt show.
A trunk show is they invited me down to show my quilts, and then I tell about them. Why, the story behind the quilt. I've done lots of challenge quilts where you get specific fabric or you get a specific challenge so I've done a lot of those.
This was my first Hoffman Challenge, 2011. This was the year my mom passed away, and this is one of her hankies that I put on it, and this is what she loved, was the teapots, teacups, and the old-fashioned bowls and stuff.
Jan Sears, a certified quilt appraiser, received her training through the American Quilters Society. Although she lives in Nebraska, the Black Hills Quilting Show is one of the events Jan attends annually.
I travel to 3 different shows, usually, and people will call me, and if I'm going by, I stop and appraise a quilt. First I look at the date of the fabric, so we're educated on different fabrics are produced in different years, and learn to recognize what years they were made in, time periods basically. And then we look at the condition of the quilt, because it could be lots of holes in it, washed, well loved, faded, or is it in pristine condition? And we also look at the history of the quilt. Is there historical significance? I do antique quilts. When I first started, mostly antique quilts. Currently I'm doing more recently made quilts. Newly made quilts, they ship them to quilt shows, and displaying them like this, they need insurance to protect them. So most of probably 95% of the appraisals I do is for insurance purposes.
Whether it's an antique that stays safely at home or a newly created treasure that travels from quilt show to quilt show, understanding the value of a quilt is important. That is why many of today's quilters have their quilts appraised and properly insured.
I just recommend that if you are showing a quilt at a quilt show, to check with your insurance company and make sure you're covered, either under your homeowner's policy or with a rider. It's very important to talk to your insurance agent and find out what you're covered for and what you're not covered for. There has been a lot of quilts that have been stolen or lost in fires or water damage. To replace a new quilt is quite a bit more expensive because you can't go out in the world and find something similar to it for sale.
Though many quilters will agree there is a unique camaraderie shared between each other, sometimes referred as a sisterhood, actually the hobby is enjoyed and mastered by both women and men.
I started quilting in 2005 on New Year's Day. Following my wife around from quilt shop, quilt shows, and so my wife likes to say my ego got the best of me, and I felt I could do a better job than she could. So basically it was my wife that got me started. I didn't hardly know what a needle and thread was. I could probably sew a button on, but that would have been about it. Some of my quilts I've designed myself, and the ones that I don't, I change parts of them that I don't particularly like and put my own touch on them. And my wife says it's from my knack of being able to look at a piece of furniture and then build it without any plans. I've won a couple of awards at our local quilt show, and I get a little ribbing about that. You know, the women ought to be winning these awards, but I think it's mostly in jest. We have his, hers, and ours. So sometimes we'll buy fabric together, and we have different tastes in fabric. So I buy all my own fabric, and she buys her fabric. But there are occasions when she might have a fabric that I would like to use. I'll ask her if I can dip into her fabric stash, but I would not think of helping myself to her stash. This would be my favorite quilt. The blue that you see in here, that my wife and I purchased at Liberty of London, and I decided that I would design a quilt using that as my predominant feature. So I start from the center, and the stars that I used in this are actually called the South Dakota star. Each state does have a quilt pattern star, and because this fabric was quite expensive, I wanted to use every last bit of it. I have little triangles here and little squares inside here. It has a focal point of the South Dakota stars. You do have a tendency to look at the center there, but there's enough that you're actually, even when you're doing that, you're looking at the whole quilt, or at least that's the effect I was trying to achieve. I've just really come to appreciate the beauty in quilts. And so when I get done with a quilt, and if I've done a good job on it, I can stand back and look at it, and it might not be perfect, but I like to think I make a nice quilt. And so that's what I like about quilting is the finished product. My wife and I are so different. My wife, it's all about the journey, and for me, it's the destination.